Let's begin with a short prayer. Father, we pray for peace in our country and for some way in which people can begin to talk to one another. We also pray that the vaccine will spread in our country and throughout the world in a timely fashion to stop the spread of the pandemic. We ask this in the name of Jesus the Lord. We were talking about largely what was going on in the Catholic Church around the time of the Second World War. One of the things that happened at this time, and most people don't quite realize it, is the liturgical movement. The monks, particularly Benedictine monasteries, they do work during the day, but the organization of the Benedictine monasteries is around the saying of the office. And we tend to think of the office as the prayers the priest says each day, but actually the office is a liturgical thing that covers the day. And the Mass, for instance, is included when you think of the office as far as the readings and everything, it's all interconnected. So anyway, the Benedictine monks at this time were forbidden to go out to other parishes. It used to be that there were lots of monasteries in Germany, for instance, that the monks in the monasteries would go out and help on the churches on Sundays. And then in the monasteries, they would have schools and they'd work farms and stuff like that during the week. But the government in Germany would not allow the monks to leave the monastery for any reason. They could go out and become a diocesan priest, but if you were a monk, you stayed in the monastery. So the monks, particularly in one particular abbey called Maria Locke, Mary of the Lake, Maria Locke, the liturgist there, I forget his name right now, very famous man in liturgy, but he applied to the Pope, Pope Pius XII, and he said, would we be permitted to experiment with the liturgy in the monastery? And he said, what we would like to do, they studied the history of liturgy, how liturgy went on, and he said, what we would like to do is go back to the earliest days of the liturgy and celebrate it the way it was in the earliest days of the church. I'll give you an example. I think you know that in the first missal that came out in the Reform, there were 4 Eucharistic prayers. Well, the second of the Eucharistic prayers is actually the oldest in the entire church. It's older than the Latin liturgy we used to use before then. It's still the second prayer, and it's the shortest by far. It was written by a man by the name of Hippolytus, who was an early martyr in the church. But anyway, it's a very, very ancient thing. But they wanted to try different things. And among the things they tried that worked, they found out that facing the people works much better than to have your back to the people in the celebration of the liturgy. They found out that the receiving of the consecrated wine as well as the host seemed to be a lot better. People enjoyed that a lot more. They noticed that if they celebrated the liturgy in the vernacular, that the people tended to participate more. When I was a youngster, very often you'd go to Mass and everyone would be saying the rosary through the Mass because they couldn't understand the Latin anyway. Having said that, because you see those things in the liturgy today, I remember one particularly that they didn't follow, that originally the tabernacle was not behind the altar. Originally, the tabernacle was in the shape of a dove, and it was suspended above the altar. And while that looks good and it sounds good as a liturgical thing, it was impossible to try and function with a tabernacle hanging from the ceiling while you were trying to do something. So that's something they never did. But what Maria Locke and several of these monasteries began to experiment with this sort of stuff. And they looked to the most ancient liturgies. The day we really changed the liturgy, in one of the parishes I went to in Hawaii, had none of the reforms. The priest had his back to the people. The people only received the host, and the Mass was said in Latin and everything. When I arrived, the whole changes had been legislated, they just hadn't been done. So whenever I went to say Mass, I followed them. And one of the things I did when I said the first Mass there, I said if Simon Peter were to walk in the front door of the church, he would more recognize what we do today than he would have last Sunday. And it's true, because our church, we look at it as new and everything, but it is the ancient form of the liturgy. So anyway, there was a monastery in France called Salins, and this particular monastery began to pick up Gregorian Chant. Now, Gregorian Chant actually comes from the 6th century. Most people don't realize that at the end of the 6th century, maybe about the 800s, they'd pretty well abandoned Gregorian chant. They had oftentimes different chants, but they abandoned Gregorian. And because many of us are very familiar with it, it occurs in the church on occasion for one thing or another. But this monastery, Salins, brought back Gregorian chant. And I should mention, when I went in the seminary, I entered the seminary in 1959. The books we used to sing the office in the seminary in Latin all had been printed in Salins. Salins Monastery had done that. And Maria Locke, as I mentioned earlier in Germany, experimented more with the liturgy. And there's a man in Austria, probably one of the most famous writers about the liturgy at the time, a man called Pius Parsch. And he wrote a magnificent set of books that explain all the readings and all the office, the Mass, everything for the entire day, for every day of the whole year. But remember, at the time they were writing, the years didn't shift around as much as they do now. We have a lot of shifting because of feasts and things. And Pius Parsch worked in Austria, and he actually studied liturgical environment in the early church. I think you know that in the earliest days of the church celebrated Mass in the catacombs. I think we probably talked about this at the first few classes we had, which was a very long time ago. But Masses were said underground, and they used to say them in the catacombs, which were these tunnels where bodies were buried under the ground. And they would always go where the tunnels intersected. You had more ways of escape if you were discovered. So anyway, they would celebrate the liturgy there. Once we got our freedom, when we came out of the catacombs, we'd been in the catacombs 350 years. When we came out of the catacombs, we were the first people to build churches. If you look at the way they worshiped in let's say the Roman Empire, good examples of Greek and Roman temples are found in Washington, D.C. If you go to the Lincoln Memorial, you notice there's nothing inside the memorial but a statue of Lincoln. And if you're going to do anything there, you do it in the plaza in front. Jefferson Memorial, the only thing in it's statue of Jefferson. Little Greek-looking temple, and it's the statue of Jefferson. And that's the way temples were in the ancient world. And everyone always worshipped outside. Even if you look at the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, there was a huge enclosed area, and then there was the Holy of Holies. But the only thing inside the Holy of Holies was the Ark of the Covenant. People worshipped in this huge patio out here. Incidentally, the reason people worshipped outside was really logical. It was so God could see them. So they would worship outside. But anyway, when Christians came up, for 350 years, we had been worshiping in the catacombs, so we didn't know what it was to worship outside. So we began to build buildings to worship in. But there were no such thing as churches then. So what we did on our buildings, you couldn't use the temple's designs because you just had the statue in it. What we did for our churches, we took the Roman throne room, and the Roman throne room is called a basilica. It's a long building with the throne for the emperor at one end and seats and everything set up facing it. And so we took that as the model, because Christ the King, Christ the Lord. So we took that as the model, and we built our churches on that. So anyway, this man was a man who studied the environment and how the environment worked, and the colors they would use and how they would decorate and everything. And there was a man in Italy called Romano Guardini, and he was attracted huge crowds when he was speaking on the liturgy. He wasn't one of the great discoverers like in Maria Locke and Salems or Austria, but when he began to speak on the liturgy, people were mesmerized, and he did as much to further the liturgical movement as anyone in the whole world. The liturgical movement was much easier in Italy than in any other country in the world, largely due to Guardini, and the second thing is Italian is so close to Latin that the people were used to understanding it and that sort of thing. In the United States, there's a Benedictine abbey called St. John's, and it became the American Center for the liturgical movement. They started a magazine called Orate Fratres, which was founded and would finally become the magazine Worship. It's the first major publication dedicated to liturgical renewal in English. You could see what was going on and why it was going on. And as the movement started and was experimented, we found many things were difficult to do and many things, were easy to do. We have a place in our diocese that is an example of the model that they would really want, that they wanted in the early church. And it's a monastery. It's a Camaldolese monastery. But if you go in for the liturgy, you go into one room where we sit, and they have the readings, and we stand for the gospel, and we have the sermon. When it's all finished, you go into a whole nother room. In the next room, it's in tiers where you stand. And down in the center at the bottom is the altar, and you stand through the whole thing. If you notice, several of the prayers of the Mass will speak of us standing, we who stand in your presence, because in the early church, everyone stood. They didn't have chairs. So anyway, this movement goes on, and St. John's Abbey was the big one in our country. Because Catholic liturgy was celebrated in Latin, it seemed difficult for reformers to get people into the spirit of a service that they did not understand. And for some, the liturgy became an end in itself, rather than a means of building community and presenting the gospel. You see, you can decide, what makes the liturgy perfect and all this kind of thing. But the reason for the liturgy actually is to gather a community. That was one of the reasons why they moved the Eucharist off the altar. They wanted people, Catholics, when I was a youngster, would come into a church. No one spoke in a church. There was absolute silence. But it's supposed to build a community. So we are supposed to sort of gather together as a community. I'll give you the theory behind it. The theory behind it is that when we gather, we greet one another and talk about one another and learn to recognize Jesus' presence in the other person. Then the liturgy begins, and we're supposed to recognize the presence of Jesus in the scripture readings over here. And then we move in to this presence of Jesus in the Eucharist that we celebrate at the altar. But then the Eucharist is received back into the community, and the community then carries that out. And that was the model they tried to put together as far as seeing it. But the whole thing is, what is the liturgy to do? Liturgy is not just liturgy. Liturgy is about, doing something. It's like I'm sure you've heard the saying. I've heard that from doctors at times. The surgery was absolutely perfect. Everything went well, but the patient died. See, the purpose of surgery isn't to go well. The purpose of a surgery is that you live through it. And so you could do everything perfectly. But if you don't live through it, who cares? So the whole thing with the liturgy is supposed to be a tool to gather a community and educate us in the gospel itself. Okay? Both by words and actions, Pope Pius X had supported the beginnings of liturgical reform. He lowered the age for First Communion. Both my parents, I think I mentioned before, made First Communion when they were in probably 7th or 8th grade when they made confirmation. Now First Communion's made in about 2nd grade, unless you convert as an adult. But if you're a Catholic, you make it in about 2nd grade, and confirmation is almost in high school. He encouraged people to receive frequently. And again, before this time, people did not receive frequently. My parents went to Mass every Sunday, and usually once or twice during the week. And my parents would go to communion once a month. Now, my sister and I were educated this other thing. Anytime we went to church, we went to communion. That was the way it came to be received. He taught that the Eucharist, this is very important because Pope Francis got in trouble for saying exactly this same thing. But this is a quote from Pius X. He taught that the Eucharist is not a reward for being good, but a necessary food to bring Christians to be good. Okay, so the Eucharist is supposed to bring us to holiness. It doesn't matter if you get holy enough and then receive the Eucharist. But this idea of being holy enough and receiving the Eucharist was what my parents were trained with, and that was what was there earlier. So they went to receive the Eucharist kind of in great fear and trepidation just once a month, very differently than we do. One giant step in the liturgical reform was the publication of missals that were written with Latin of the service on one page and the English translation on the other page. Catholics could respond using the Latin and read what it meant in the English, so that one of the ways they recognized immediately it was important for the liturgy that people could be involved in it. So the first way they tried to involve us was teach us the Latin responses. So we got missals so we could read what it meant in English, but we knew what to say in Latin to respond to the priest. And so that became, when I was a little boy, all the responses were said by the altar boy. If you became an altar boy, you had to memorize these Latin responses, and you gave the Latin responses to the priest. But now they wanted the congregation to start making the responses. So they developed these missals, and the missals were a huge thing. Almost any Catholic would have one at the time. Pius XII strongly supported the liturgical movement, and he wrote an encyclical called Mediator Dei. And mediator, it's the English word mediator, which stands, between. And Dei, of course, is God. So he called the liturgy the link between you and I and God, the mediator between us and God. And he set the stage for the great liturgical changes that would then come about during his successor, John the 23rd. But he set the stage for all of that. As a result, Catholics involved in the liturgical movement were not unprepared for the changes that would come. But every Catholic was startled by the extent of the changes when they came. Just to give you an example, when I was in the seminary and the council was going on that made these changes, my high hope was that the Mass would be in English. That was what I wanted. I wanted the Mass in English. And the reason I wanted it is because I did not understand Latin. I'm terrible at languages. In fact, I'll tell you an interesting thing, a story at the beginning. As they were getting ready for the council under John the 23rd, they were talking about what was going on, and there was a very conservative movement led by a man called Cardinal Ottaviani, and a very liberal movement was being led by John the 23rd, the Pope. As we got close to the council, Cardinal Ottaviani said it was impossible for anyone to change any word in the liturgy. Now, I was more leaning to the liberal, and I was thinking, who cares? We aren't going to change any words. We're just going to translate it into English. But Pope John the 23rd, the very next day, added the name Joseph to the Eucharistic prayer. And I'm thinking, well, that's not a very liberal move. What could be more conservative than St. Joseph? But I didn't realize that the cardinal and the pope were fighting over the control of the altar, because whoever controlled the altar controls the church. We oftentimes say we live what we celebrate. So if you're in charge there. So John the 23rd took control of the altar. And while I regarded myself as liberal, I never thought we'd come out with 4 liturgical prayers. I never thought they would be different than the translation I had of the Latin Eucharistic prayer. I never thought that we would have communion in the hand. I thought we'd have communion under 2 species, but I never thought we'd be handling the host. You have to remember, when I was in seminary, we couldn't even handle a chalice that the Eucharist was, a ciborium, the Eucharist was in, or a chalice the consecrated wine was in. These are just it's really the changes. Even people who knew changes were coming didn't know what were coming. Pius XI, in 1922, established an institute for Christian archaeology and built a public gallery for the treasures of the Vatican. Any of you who've ever been to Rome and been to Vatican City and gone through the great Vatican museums, this is the man who built them, okay? He built them, and what he wanted to do was, remember, we're beginning to see some conflicts now. We begin to see conflicts. Paleontology seemed to say we were descended from God knows what, way at the beginning, moving through evolution to end up with human beings. And the scriptures seem to say in 7 days everything was created. And so we're having conflicts like this. Well, what Pius XI wanted to do was to make sure that the teachings we had about the church, about where the church was and what they'd done, were true. So what he did, establish a church field of archaeology. Most people don't know that the church has experts in all these fields. I think I've mentioned before that the Big Bang theory was discovered by the Jesuit who was in charge of the Vatican Observatory, and he's the one who propounded it. Stephen Hawking, who got the Nobel Prize, he got the Nobel Prize by determining the exact date when it took place. That was the particular thing he did. But it was a Jesuit who discovered that somehow there was a beginning, and the universe has been expanding. And so all Hawkins did was mathematically play it back. I shouldn't say all, because it's a very complex thing, but mathematically played it back and ended up with when it started. So anyway, he built this museum and started an institute for Christian archaeology. He expanded the College of Cardinals and included many nationalities. Originally, in fact, up till this, about 1922, the College of Cardinals was made up of the pastors of the churches in the city of Rome. And so the Pope would pick, originally all the pastors did it. Then as time went on, there were more churches. Over a period of time, the church would pick out certain people and give them the title cardinal. But they were always pastors of the churches in Rome. And then at a certain point, they decided to do this, to really expand it in many nationalities. But if you become a cardinal, you automatically are pastor of one of the churches in Rome. And you don't function there. It's like the bishop is basically pastor of the cathedral, but there's a rector who administers the cathedral. The bishop has other things to do. Same thing with the cardinals, but technically they're pastors of a church in Rome. He established much closer ties with the Eastern churches. The Eastern churches and the Catholic Church had been at war with one another over religious things originally, and then finally with the impact of the Muslims, because we never came sufficiently to their defense. The Eastern churches blamed the fall of the whole Eastern Church when Constantinople fell under the Muslims, blamed it on the Catholic Church. Now, at this point, 1922, he begins to establish closer ties. His letters to the church concern current topics, and he wanted the church to enter into an understanding of science without fear. And so the Christians oftentimes were staying away from science because they were afraid that they would end up disproving something in the Bible or disproving something in the church. And Pius the 11th made one of the hallmarks of his pontificate something we all learn in philosophy. You know, if something is true, it's true everywhere, always. So if something is true in, let's say, let's just take archaeology. If something is true, I don't know whether I'm talking archaeology, but let's say something is true, the existence of dinosaurs, because we can find their bones and stuff. We know dinosaurs existed. That's true. So that's true in theology, in science, but it is not true in theology. And because we have no record of dinosaurs being created, so it's not true. Well, that's baloney. Either there were dinosaurs and Scripture doesn't mention their creation, or there were never dinosaurs and science is lying about the bones they're finding. There's only one truth. So I said, as a result of that, we should pursue science, because when science arrives at a truth, that truth that science arrives will support the truths that we arrive at, because there is only one truth. So it will support that. And I would again go back to the Big Bang Theory. Do you know, before the Big Bang Theory, in fact, the reason the church began to look to try and prove there was a beginning was because scientists were saying the world always was. And by scientists, I'm talking Albert Einstein. He said we are in a static universe. It sat this way forever. It's always been this way, always there. And so the church set about to try and establish that the universe did begin, okay? And so they did. They established when the universe began. Hawkins just found out when. So he had a fluent knowledge of many foreign languages, had many contacts with people in different countries. That's one of the big things to become a pope now. If you watch, like Francis, when Francis gets up to give a talk, he'll normally say things in 5 or 6 languages. The best one at this was Pius XII. I think he could speak almost anything. But they would get up, they use lots of languages. And the idea, I would say that within my lifetime, the Pope has come to be seen as an international figure, okay? It used to be that we were all kind of part of an Italian church. It was kind of seen. In fact, I think many of you remember the saying, when they want to say something is true, they'll say, well, is the Pope Italian? Okay, that doesn't work anymore, but it did for a while, okay? So he brought modern learning in many fields into the church, and at his becoming Pope, he went out on the balcony of St. Peter's to bless the people, something that had not been done in Italy since the Garibaldi took over the Papal States. The Pope never became visible to anyone outside the confines of, like, St. Peter's and his palace and stuff. But on this, he goes out on the balcony. I think you know that balcony looks right down to the Tiber and has that huge square where people from all over the world gather. And he's the first one to do that. He went out on the balcony. He consecrated a native bishop in Japan and made it clear that the church should incorporate local customs into its life. So he created a Japanese bishop because there were Catholics in Japan. They'd been Catholics in Japan for several hundred years, but they had never had a native bishop. They had a Japanese priest, but he created a Japanese bishop and then gave this church some honor. Like, for instance, the church in Japan, if we were to take the church in Japan, it can never have the history of the church in Rome or of the church in Europe. It can never have the history, have the size of the church in the United States, for instance. And if you look back historically, churches like the church in Rome or in Italy had great honor because of their age. The American church, we had great honor because of the amount of money we contributed to what was going on in missionary works and all this kind of things. And Germany, they had great honor because of their history of education and stuff like that. So when these newer churches came in, they were seen like stepchildren. And Pius the 11th ended that. He said that church in Japan has an equal voice with any other church in the whole, and their customs need to be valued. He wanted native education of clergy so that non-European clergy would no longer be simple imitations of European clergy. The same guidelines were given to the African church. They wanted African bishops, followed their African procedures. So if you go into, like, for instance, an African community, you'll find dancing is a huge part of their liturgy. It is just integrated into the liturgy. In our country, that's not part of the liturgy. But traveling around the world today, before, like long before I was ordained, if you traveled around the world, liturgy was virtually the same everywhere. When I travel around the world today, liturgy is very, very different. They're using the same prayers, but the customs and things are very, very different when you go through Poland or go through Germany or go through the Soviet Union. They're just very, very different. And it's because each church has something to contribute to this. And after Pius XI, they looked at that. In 1923, the Muslim nations of the Middle East began to go through great changes. In Turkey, it was the end of the Ottoman Empire. Turkey controlled, the Ottoman Empire controlled that whole area. The whole Muslim world was under the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire had been founded by the guy who conquered Istanbul, conquered Constantinople and turned it into Istanbul. When he conquered that, then they owned that whole east, and they included Greece and all kinds of countries. But the Ottoman Empire began to get weak. And a man rose up in Turkey. I don't know his original name, but he's known in history as Ataturk, which means the Turk, okay? So Ataturk began to rise and an absolute ruler, and he wanted to turn Turkey into a Western-style nation. So he tried to do that. Islam was no longer the state religion. He forbid it. In fact, Ataturk used to drive around in his car, and if he saw a man wearing a fez, those tall things, he shot him. He wanted, there was no public display of this religion. The Roman alphabet was adopted as well as our calendar. They don't use the Muslim calendar, and they don't use Arabic letters for the Turkish language. Throughout the Arab world, English and French protectorates began to give way to independent countries. Independence began to spread now, and which the influence of Islam remained strong. So they'd been Islamic countries under both England and France, but they retained their sort of Islamic, what do you want to call it, their Islamic caste or culture, but they were controlled by France and England. As France and England began to give way to these places, then their own culture began to rise. Iran, though it was not an Arab country, is still Islamic and went through great modernization under the Shah. And under the leadership of his son, Muhammad, the country turned to the West. Now, the United States turned to the West, United States, and to Russia, which is north of them. The country endured great turmoil between forces for change and those who wanted an Islamic state. A revolution overthrew Muhammad, and Khomeini became both the political and the religious leader of the country. Okay? This short look at Muslim countries shows that they have not yet worked out a way to function with the separation of church and state. And we'll watch like there's an ongoing fight in Iran between the guy who is president, premier, whatever it is, and the head of the church in the country. And it's hard to tell who's in charge at times. But countries of hostility between Christians and Muslims have led to a great mistrust of intentions. The cure in the Christian community of our great mistrust of one another as denominations occurred in the Nazi situation. Because in the Nazi situation, faithful Lutherans, faithful Catholics, faithful Methodists, faithful Jehovah's Witnesses were all in concentration camps together. We were lumped together, and we had everything in common. But the ones who were loyal to the Nazis, Catholics, Jehovah's Witnesses, all these who were loyal to the Nazis, they had nothing in common with one another. So the liturgical movement for us was born there. We have yet to have something that will unite the Muslim and the Christian world. We have yet to have something that will do that. The West's interest in the oil reserves of the Mideast have also affected the relationship between Christian countries and Muslim countries. It's also important to remember that there are many different religious views among Muslims, as many as there are among Christians. Like oftentimes we see wars break out between the different factions of Muslims in a country. And it's always surprising to me, anyway, I think of them all as Muslims. But having traveled there in the past few years, I know that they're very, very different. And we know about the Sunni and the Shia, for instance, but there are many, many different areas. The whirling dervish, those people who dance and stuff, they come out of the Muslim community too. They're persecuted by the Sunni and the Shia, but they're Muslim as the others. In the 1700s and 1800s, several million Jews migrated to the United States. They were fleeing poverty, hatred, and murder, actually, in Christian lands of Eastern Europe. And while they were free of the worst forms of persecution, both Catholics and Protestants, even clergy, expressed anti-Jewish attitudes, so that the anti-Semitism was sort of woven into all the other religions, sort of woven into the other religions. I've talked before about the Monastery of Maria Locke. Well, not far from there is called the Monastery of Attal. And Attal is on a mountain, the monastery, and the town is down below. But the town is Oberammergau, where they have the Passion Play. And the Passion Play was written in Attal, the monastery. And when all the monasteries were closed, Attal was not closed. And the reason it wasn't closed was because the Passion Play was so anti-Semitic. The Nazis wanted to keep it going, okay? It shows that that's just, the Passion Play, since the end of the war, has been rewritten 4 times. And each time they clear out more of the anti-Semitism. Christian Europe had a long history of anti-Jewish feeling, often blaming them for the death of Jesus. This background made it easy for Christians just to sit back when Jews were persecuted. While they didn't necessarily persecute them, they wouldn't defend them when they were persecuted. And you have to be very careful about the way you teach in a church, because you can be teaching something about like the death of Jesus. Did the Jews kill Jesus? You could say the Romans killed him. You could say the high priests killed him. I mean, there's a lot of guilt to go around in it if you watch the death of Jesus. But it's very easy to preach against one thing or another. You have to be careful about how that is heard and what it can lead to. The wholesale killing of the Jews began with the leaders of Nazi Germany, but often they were aided people who were not Nazi, but simply anti-Jewish. It's interesting that if you were to go through Europe, you would find, I wish I had a number to put on it, you'd find many, 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 many Jews being hidden in Catholic monasteries and convents. But simultaneously, you'd find out many of those people were turned in by a priest or nun in the monastery or convent. It was just, it was a strange thing. Many were jealous of successful Jews, and even today, Christians are concerned about how deeply anti-Semitism is embedded in the Christian mind. It's something, it's been there a long time. One of the gentlemen, I forget his name now. I don't think it's Heschel, but because the next thing deals with Heschel, I have his thing in mind. But anyway, one of the men who was in a concentration camp, and I think he wrote the book called Will to Meaning. I forget his name now. But anyway, he said that the thing that was most disturbing to him when he was in the concentration camp in Auschwitz was every morning to see how many of the guards went to the Catholic Church outside the thing and went to Mass and Communion every day. It's just, there was just a disconnect, something really strange going on. Heschel, shocked by anti-Jewish attitudes in France, founded Zionism as a movement to establish the Jewish state in Palestine. It reached such a state in Europe that they had to find a way to protect themselves. Now, we're talking long before the start of the Nazi movement, but they're watching anti-Jewish attitudes, and he's watching it in France, for instance, a Catholic country. And he decides that what they need is a Jewish state. I'd like to tell you that, I think we talked about this, but the way Catholic schools got started in the United States was because the way Catholics were persecuted in public schools. They were singled out and persecuted. And so one way to cure it is to get the persecuted away from the persecutors, okay? That's not the best solution. The best solution is to somehow get them to work together. But that he sees Herschel is to get them out. And he's considered the father of Israel. He's also considered the father of Zionism. Zionism is not really a religious movement. It's a political movement. But it's a political movement to create a safe area for Jews. And understand, Jews were persecuted for their race, okay? Now, we think of Jews as all being religious Jews, but there were Jews in many, like, for instance, Teresa Benedicta, forget her name now. I think her first name was Ruth. But Teresa Benedicta was a Jewish woman, and she was a Carmelite Catholic nun in Holland. And she went to Auschwitz and died because of her race, okay? She wasn't Jewish religion, but because of her race, she died. So Zionism is a racial thing with the Jews. The whole idea of a Jewish state received much more support as a result of discoveries of what Jews had been subjected to in the Nazi areas of Europe. And the state was declared in 1948. And all they did was create a new problem. They took the Jews out of Europe, and then they pushed the Palestinians off their land and planted them in Palestine. So, I mean, it wasn't really much of a solution. It was an independent and Jewish state, and certainly, they worked to support them. But the type of conflict, it's just that what the Jews had been in Europe, the Palestinians now are in Palestine. The unresolved issue of this whole thing is the rights of Arabs who claim Palestine as their homeland. Martin Buber called Arabs and Jews to create a unified state, but the thing is still unresolved. You know, it'd be like the United States. In the United States, we have a state, okay? We have a strong Protestant presence, a strong Catholic presence. But this is not a Catholic country, and this is not a Protestant country. This is a country with freedom of religion, okay? Now, they have to do something like that in Israel, where it is not a Jewish nation and is not an Arab nation, but it's a nation where Jews and Arabs live, okay? But that doesn't seem to be close even right now. In 1914, a revolutionary spirit began to exist in Mexico. And when one of the gentlemen came to power, he was in great opposition to the church. I think you know it's not unusual in Europe for people to be deeply Catholic and very anti-clerical. Well, that's what was going on there. In Mexico, the people were very, very deeply Catholic, but oftentimes the clergy there lived like royalty, and so they were very, very against the clergy. While many important Catholics did work for reform, the large landowners were Catholics, and the clergy tended to oppose reform. Why? Because the large landowners were very wealthy, and the large landowners were what supported the church. Poor people couldn't support the church. So these large landowners did, so the church tended to defend them. A new constitution in Mexico nationalized all the lands, all the water, and all the mineral resources. So all of that belonged to the state. It promised workers an 8-hour day and forbade child labor. Places of worship became property of the state, and the church was forbidden to operate schools. Okay? To this day, if we were to get together, let's say that we're a community in Mexico, and we were to get together and decide to build a church. If we got together, collected the money and everything, the state would never build us the church. Got together and we were put up this church. As soon as we put the cross on it, it belongs to the government. Now that means the government maintains it and takes care of it and everything, but the government owns it. See, it's slightly different in France. If you go to France, all the churches that were built before the Revolution belong to the government, like Notre Dame and stuff like that. They all belong to the government. But churches built after the Revolution belong to the church itself in the individual places. But not so in Mexico. It all belongs to the government. And they forbid the church to operate schools. I think you know the education of youth is the key to being involved in government and everything. Priests were forbidden to vote. Priests could not hold public office, and they couldn't criticize the government. Can you imagine being forbidden to criticize the government? I can't. That wouldn't go over in the United States for anybody. In many areas, the land laws were not enforced, but in some areas, the church came under great persecution. Okay? So we'll call it there. We're moving up now to the French Revolution for the church itself, but we'll call it here and pick it up next week. Thank you very much for your time.